Welcome to the Raccoon Creek Podcast. I'm Captain K. Today we are pleased to have with us a native Texas writer. She has already published 6 novels that are available for purchase on Amazon and is currently working on yet another book. Please give a warm welcome to Odell Larkin. Odell, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Carl. I'm very happy to be here.
So tell me, Odell, how does someone become a writer?
Well, first of all, I believe you have to be a good storyteller, and then you need a great story to tell. You see, my mama was a good storyteller, and so I grew up on stories of her crazy and wacky relatives, the Great Depression, and even World War II. And even though some of her stories were sad even to the point of tragic, most had humor. And so it would be from those stories that I would first realize my dream of one day becoming a writer. But then life happened, and so I became a wife and a mother instead. And although on the outside my life seemed perfectly normal and happy, slowly, very slowly, my perfectly normal and happy life would somehow begin to fall apart around.
So Odell, what happened?
Well, 5 years ago, I had a complete mental breakdown.
That must have been terrible for you.
It was. One minute I was sitting on my couch, and the next I was handcuffed and sitting instead in the back of a deputy's patrol car on my way to a psychiatric hospital 100 miles away. For my own good, of course, and for the safety of the public. At least that's what they kept telling me as I was being taken from my normal and happy life. But once there, and just like in those old stories that my mama used to tell, I began to notice that along with the sadness and tragedy of what was happening to me, somehow there was humor as well. For the other patients on the ward, the others, as I would later come to call them, were not only crazy, supposedly like me, but they were also wacky as hell. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Weren't we all crazy? At least in the eyes of the rest of the world. Well, yes, we were. But the others, well, they weren't only crazy and sometimes even dangerous, but they were also funny. Something that the storyteller and one-day writer in me would find fascinating. And so, as my days and nights as a guest within a state mental facility would come to pass, it would be the antics of the others, Teresa, Crazy Carol, Big George, and soon, that would somehow save me from not only my deep and darkest thoughts, but they would also and finally give me a great story to tell. And so, But Still I Smile, my first novel, based on a whole lot of truth and just a little bit of fiction, was born. If not from my lifelong dream to write, then from the unfolding of an honest-to-God tragedy of true events from which I couldn't have dreamed up even in my wildest imagination. Carl, here's one of my favorite passages from But Still I Smile. It gives you just a small taste of what life was like locked up inside a mental ward. I missed my second group therapy session because I had to meet with my first doctor. Now, I'm not an expert on doctors, but I was having a hard time believing that this one had a diploma hanging on his wall. He was short, shy, and older than ancient. It was obvious that he was uneasy with me and our surroundings in the ward, and if that wasn't bad enough, he read his questions from a folded sheet of paper. Since he hadn't shown enough respect for me to properly introduce himself, the man would forever and always be known to me as good old Dr. Stupid. "Mrs. Jacobs, are you still having thoughts of harming yourself?" he would ask. "No," I simply replied. Any thoughts of harming someone else? Although I replied no, there was at least a couple of people that came to mind, with good old Dr. Stupid at the very top of the list. He smiled, and I was more than just a little surprised that he had so easily believed me. "Mrs. Jacobs, are you hearing voices?" Once again, I lied and simply replied no. "Wonderful! I'm so happy to hear that," said Dr. Stupid, as if he alone had suddenly cured me from my insanity. And me, well, I couldn't help but calmly stare back at Dr. Stupid and marvel at how much better I was getting at being insane.
Odell, can you tell us more about the hospital?
Well, it was a dangerous place. Yes, it was funny and crazy, but it was also frightening and sometimes violent. Most of the patients were homeless people suffering from serious mental issues or addicts from the streets, while others like me, well, we were only hopeless and depressed. And so during my days at the hospital in the older adult unit, as if being labeled crazy wasn't bad enough, now I was considered old too, I lived in constant fear. And that was something that I hadn't experienced since my childhood. And while obviously there could be danger at any time, there was this one man in particular, a gang member named Santiago, who I would later witness attacking poor old Dr. Stupid, putting him in the hospital, and not a hospital like where we were, but one where they actually tried to make you better. And then there were the others, some not as dangerous, but still unpredictable, like this one woman named Teresa that, believe it or not, would become a very good friend to me there at the hospital.
So how did you and Teresa become friends?
Well, first off, Teresa was as mean as a buzzsaw, so without a doubt, it was better to be her friend than her enemy. And believe me, from my first moments in the ward, it was Teresa that I would fear the most. And even though she was only about 5 foot tall and maybe 90 pounds, she was the loudest and the angriest of anyone there, even the dangerous gang member named Santiago. For Teresa, well, she cussed like a sailor. Seriously, I had never before even heard some of the words she used. And since she called most of the doctors by their first names, or even worse, it didn't take me long to figure out that it was Teresa in charge at the ward, and definitely not the people in the white coats, as they pretended to be. And then there were the others, each one with their own story. Stories and characters for which I was fortunate enough to later write about. Like Kenny, the veteran and alcoholic who, much like my own father, had gone over the edge after losing everything, even if it was only his own fault. And there was Big George, a very angry and scary man who eventually I would also befriend, giving him my one and only blanket when no one else would, simply because he was cold and I was not. There was Margaret. She was a first grade teacher and drug addict who was so deeply saddened by what she saw as her failures in life that, well, by now, I would be fairly certain that she's ended it all. And then there was Soon and Crazy Carol, of course. The first, Soon, a refugee from Vietnam, that it would seem would never find the courage or even the will to face life outside the locked doors of the hospital. While the other, Crazy Carol, well, we should just all pray that Crazy Carol never escapes. There were many others, of course, that would come and go, but it would be Teresa that to this day has remained with me, if only here in my heart. And not just because in the end She would gift me with a picture she had colored and signed. But because she was so much like my daddy, angry and loud, all the while being the one person I wanted most to please. For you see, being raised by an alcoholic father who was always angry and violent, I had learned very early on to smile, pretend away the pain, and somehow, and in spite of everything, survive. And so in a strange way, I would have to give Daddy much of the credit for my ability to later survive while being locked away in a mental ward. Funny how that would all work out. One of the very things that had broken me, sending me in the middle of the night to a psychiatric hospital while shackled in a pair of handcuffs, would somehow become the very thing that would keep me alive once I was there. For if I had learned nothing else from my childhood, I had learned how to survive by becoming invisible when surrounded by a cruel and hopeless world of insanity.
Odell, do you think some of your mental issues began in your childhood?
Definitely. Although thinking back now, I wonder if it didn't have more to do with me keeping all the trauma and abuse a secret while pretending at the same time that everything in my world was perfect. You know, we all have our different ways of dealing with problems, and over the years, mine had become to pretend that the bad things weren't happening, even when they were. And so when new and bad things began happening later in my adult life, unfortunately, the trauma would once again become very real, and suddenly I could no longer smile and pretend it all away as I had been taught to do as a child.
Odell, were the doctors and professionals able to help you during your stay?
Honestly, a few were helpful, but most were not. For you see, I believe that our mental health system is broken, maybe even as broken as the patients it's supposed to treat. And so in the end, the miracle wouldn't be that I had somehow survived during my stay in a mental ward, but that eventually I would find a way to heal as a result. There's a passage from the book that gives some good insight into what I was up against during my time there. And so, Carl, if you don't mind, I'd like to read it. The following day, I was pulled out of group therapy yet again by a representative from the Burnett County Behavioral Institute. The very serious gentleman asked me to have a seat at one of the empty tables in the main ward. He didn't introduce himself, say hello, or ask me how I was doing, but unlike Dr. Stupid, he didn't seem to be bothered by the others and our crazy surroundings. Mrs. Jacobs, we've been holding you for your own safety and for the safety of others. However, the hospital can no longer confine you against your will, he began to explain. Yes, finally, I was going home. I knew God was listening. But before I could run to my room and gather my few things, my visitor continued as he slid some papers and a pen across the table to me, something that I was beginning to learn was never a good thing. So, you have two choices, Mrs. Jacobs. Number one, he explained, you can voluntarily sign these papers to commit yourself. Or number two, we will have a judge issue an order for you to be held here until you are deemed sane and fit to be released back out into the community. Released back out into the community. The man spoke of me as if I were a wild and injured animal. My visitor then sat back in his chair and stared back at me as he awaited my decision. I found myself sitting ramrod stiff in my chair, staring back at him and then at the papers and pen in front of me. I knew I was the one that was supposed to be crazy, but What he had just proposed didn't exactly sound like two choices to me, although I had to admit that for the first time since being committed, I was actually being given a choice in my own life. Be committed or be committed.
So, Odell, when did things begin to get better for you?
Well, Carl, it's sad to say, but not for a very long time. For although I was only committed for a relatively short time compared to some of the others, a great deal had changed in my absence, if not in my world. In fact, so much had changed in the world outside that suddenly I was faced with yet again two choices. Give in once more to the dark depression as I had before, or find a whole new way, all on my own, to not only survive, but to somehow learn to smile again. And so for me, writing would become both. And although over the years I had long thought of myself as a good storyteller, I didn't yet believe that I could actually write. And so the challenge would then become, did I have the talent and the discipline that it would take to actually put the story of what had happened to not only me, but to the others, to paper, and eventually into what would be my first book? And so in the end, it would not be doctors, but words. Words that I dared to write upon a blank sheet of paper that were destined to save me. Save me from a time when the sound of my own voice was more painful than even the silence, and the days of being heard had long faded away. You asked me in the beginning, how does one become a writer? Well, there's one last passage from my book, But Still I Smile, that for me tells that story best. May I read it?
Absolutely. Go right ahead.
My dream was always to be a published author. Over the years, there were many times that I made a serious attempt at writing, but inevitably, my imagination and even the words had failed me. I recall when many years before, while interviewing for a job, the owner of the place of business asked me to state my future goals, to which I immediately responded to write something important and to have that work published. Well, I got the job that day, but the owner was quick to point out that my answer was wrong. He stated the correct answer, and my goal undoubtedly should have been to make his business the best in town. I quit that miserable job 2 years later, but I never gave up on my dream of writing. And so after I returned home from the older adult unit of the hospital and was faced once again with the same old challenges of life as well as a few new ones, I began to spend endless hours putting to paper the events of that unforgettable time in my life that everyone else wanted to forget. Finally, I had something important to say, and I was committed to putting the time and effort into writing the remarkable story that God had entrusted only to me, for at last I had a great story to tell. But the story wasn't just my story alone, because very early on I realized that God had also given me the task of telling the stories for the others as well, and somehow theirs would become almost more important to me than even the telling of my own. And so in the end, I would at last become that writer that I had always hoped to be, not so much for myself, but for the others. And no longer would I allow them to be forgotten in that place of no return.
Odell, where can we purchase your book, But Still I Smile?
All of my books are sold exclusively on Amazon in both paperback and ebook. If you search Odell Larkin Books, It should bring each of my 6 current books up with the first, but still I smile among them. I'd love to come back sometime in the future to talk about some of my other books that have come to mean so much to me, and I hope to my readers.
Odell, thanks for joining us today. Do you have any final words or thoughts that you would like to leave with us?
Well, thanks so much for having me today, Carl. And yes, I think it's important that we end by saying that if you or someone you know is suffering from depression or mental illness, don't hesitate to seek out help. The path to good mental health is not always simple or easy, but it cannot and it must not go ignored. And as always, thanks for reading Odell Larkin.